Welcome at this new episode of Security on Air. My name is Frank ter Kuile, and today we are discussing cybersecurity again, like last year, because this cybersecurity remains a very relevant topic in our industry. And just to show you a bit of the relevance, I've got a few numbers to share with you. If you can see on the screen, about 93% of all company networks can be penetrated by hackers or by cyber attacks. 50% of businesses face attacks since last year, or 50% more. 80% of critical infrastructure was targeted already last year. And if you ask executives, 41% don't think that their infrastructure is kept up to date, basically. If you put it in economic terms, I learned that the money that goes into this industry is actually the third biggest economy after the US and China. A very relevant industry or very relevant topic. And to help me discover it more, I have invited three specialists in the field today. I will introduce you to them. First of all, we have in Eindhoven via Zoom Elisa Costante, Cybersecurity Woman of the Year. I learned last week via LinkedIn. You work for Forescout. Elisa, maybe a quick introduction from your side, who you are and what you do.
Yeah, so I actually lead the research team in Forescout. It's called Vedere Labs. It's a team of threat researchers, and we look at the cybersecurity landscape, especially for OT, building automation, and IoT devices. Forescout is a cybersecurity company. We do network monitoring, analytics, and control. What does it mean is basically we see every device which is connected in a network and what that device does, and what control we can put in place to, for instance, mitigate cyber threats and cyber risks.
Cool. Well, welcome. And then we have Abhishta, assistant professor at the University of Twente. Welcome, Abhishta. Can you...
So I am assistant professor at University of Twente. I work with empirical measurements of economic impact of cyber attacks. That's mostly the focus of my research. And I'm also leading the theme of a socio-economic context of security within the Twente Center for Cybersecurity Research, which is a consortium of public-private bodies looking into security within this region.
Cool. Welcome. And then we have our very own Arthur van Leeuwen, my own colleague. Arthur, you're lead software engineer. Maybe a quick explanation of what your daily business is about.
My current daily business is about making sure that we can deliver and securely install our products with customers. And we're developing new software and new stuff every day, and new features. And the trick is in how to get them to our customers and deployed in a safe and secure way so that they can actually rely on it.
Yeah. Yeah, okay, thank you very much. So the main topic of today is how cybersecurity moves more to the physical domain. I guess that's, hackers or cyber threats or hackers are looking for new ways, and one of the or to get entry into systems. One of the entry points could be IoT systems, or we see that it's maybe a trend. Elisa, can you elaborate a little bit about that? What is that? I think I read it in your research as well. I think we can put up a slide on the screen just to give us talk us through a little bit. What is a typical? What does it look in a business context?
Yeah, for sure. So IoT is also referred as the Internet of Everything, right? Everything that now has as an internet connection can actually pose a threat to an organization. Most of the times we speak of organizations, and if you see in their network, you see a lot of elements which include an IP camera, which is used for security surveillance system. You actually have doorbells nowadays that have an internet connection, and so they become Internet of Things. They are like smart devices. Everything that has a connection is typically called smart, and you will be surprised on how many things in our buildings actually have a connection. Whenever you enter in a building, if you have a badge to handle a bank, for instance, there is actually an internet connection or a connection between that device and other elements of the network, which can include a lift. You know, if you are authorized to go in a certain area or not, in a hospital, in an airport, or in a bank. All these elements are connected together. And what happens is, it's called the Internet of Things, because before and till now, it's very difficult for us to understand that those elements actually can be reached out by the internet and how it happens. So most of the people believe that those networks are air-gapped, which means, they only communicate within each other. But that's actually not true. We have made a lot of research that identify how many of these devices are actually either connected to mainframes, to servers, there are connections to the internet sometimes, and that basically exposes the network itself to some threats. In one of our really latest research, it was released the 1st of June. I invite you to actually go and look at it. It's called R for IoT. And what this stands for is ransomware for IoT. So what indeed in our research we have discovered is that the threat actors that basically are after making damage or gaining having a financial gain, what they can do, for instance, to deploy a ransomware is not entering, as they usually do, via a phishing email or via a website vulnerabilities. They actually can use an IP camera that is misconfigured, which is connected to the internet, or they can use a building automation system, a building automation control, which is again misconfigured, connected to the internet, to actually enter in the system and then move laterally, is called in the technicalities language, which means they can actually then go after more IT system, frame, server, and deploy a ransomware and asking for money in order to raise the safe state of systems.
Yeah. And then I think what was also very interesting from your research is that you looked at the different devices and which are most vulnerable, or which. And to my surprise, I saw that in your graph that physical access control actually scores as a #1 threat or entry point. Where does this come from?
Yeah, so when you compute risk for a device, right, you need to understand how risky is this device for my environment. And we have came up with a formula actually that puts different things into account to compute the risk level of an element of a device. And this formula takes into account the number of vulnerabilities that the device has, but also how many connections that device has with other elements in the network, which basically, if that device is attacked, will allow an attacker to move forward. And other things like the criticality of that device itself, is a critical device for the functioning of my building, for instance. So putting those things together, actually building automation controllers, and another thing which is also very connected to building automation, which is UPS, came out as being very risky because they are riddled with vulnerabilities. And patching vulnerabilities in IoT and OT devices is very expensive. It takes like units sometimes to actually physically go and access a device because you need to plug in like a special port to actually update it with the new firmware. And also because there is like still a lack of awareness, like updating those systems to new firmware is not really something that is done because of most of the times for a people problem. Who is owning those devices? Is it facility? Is it an IT problem? Is it an InfoSec problem? So that's actually something that organization also needs to address. It's like, okay, there is a sort of gray area of an increasing amount of those devices that enter the network, but nobody knows about them and nobody owns them. So nobody's liable for them.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Arthur, I think access control is our bread and butter. Yeah. Should we be worried about this?
Not worried per se, but as Elisa already said, aware and prepared. There's so many different threat routes and attack vectors that we need to be aware of as companies, and that our customers need to take into account, that we cannot ourselves devise protections against every single one of them. But the main problem is who is responsible in the end for making sure that things are up to date, for making sure that things are secure. And having that awareness and actually preparing for eventualities and preparing for updates in and of itself is an important aspect that we really should highlight and we try to help with. And it's basically the one major driver of our innovation at this point, because there's so much change in the expectations of our devices and of the ease of management of them, that we're working towards lessening the impact there.
Yeah, because, well, to be honest, if I am a security manager in a big bank or something, and I invest in a big system, you know, or in a big access control system, I would say, hey, these manufacturers by default, this is secure, or can I not be,
It may be secure at the point of installation, but it need not stay secure over time, because technology advances, and not only our technology advances, but also the technology of those attacking our systems advances. For instance, a couple of decades back, ransomware was not really a thing, but things have gotten much more connected and powerful enough to do the encryption work, to do the actual ransom holding. So the attacks have changed, and so our response to the attacks has to change as well. And it's an illusion to be able to have the idea that you can just put in security and not keep it up to date and not keep it up to the current times.
Yeah. And Abhishta, from your point of view, I think this is also part of what your daily work is, or of your research. What's your point of view, or how do you listen to this?
Yeah, so I would probably reiterate the most important word is probably being aware of what risks are there also over time. So there are additional functionalities that probably access control provides in form of IoT, right? In the past, if you want a new person to have a key of the lock, you need to get the key made and things like that. Today, you can just put a card, program it, and give it to someone, right? So that's some added functionality that newer forms of access control have provided us. But since it's moved more towards the cyber domain, whatever threats that the cyber domain posed to other systems in the past to computers also apply to these systems today. Right? So, and companies need to be aware that, well, in the past, the locks used to get old, you have to change locks, the time period used to be bigger there. Here, the software changes way more often. So they need to update the software just the same way they used to update Windows in the past or things like that. So when you apply these kind of newer access controls in your company, you should be also aware about, okay, how do I maintain these systems over time? And also, the people who are using these systems should be aware of how it's different from just opening a lock. And that might actually improve the situation as well.
Yeah. And is the general awareness too low or too... Elisa, can you say something about that? What from your experience?
Well, it makes me feel old, but it's been more than 10 years that I am actually in the field.
Sorry for that.
But more than ever, actually now awareness is on the increase. Like I remember at the beginning, of my career, when we really had to have meetings with customers in which we would explain to them the risks. Now most of them, there is a maturity level that you can actually track. And typically in financial, so when you say the example of the bank, typically financial institutions actually have quite a good awareness, quite a good system. They actually have in place SOC, which is Security Operations Centers, NOC, which is Network Operations Centers, so they know how to operate. But there is a variety of organizations that still needs protection, that still are critical, like utilities, schools, education, jails. And they have no idea, but they are still cyber physical system. All the doors of the jails actually can be opened with remote control, and they have plenty of cameras for surveillance. Actually, there was one of recent research which was done in which some of the feeds from the streams, actually from IP cameras of jails and universities and daycare, could actually be visible from hackers online because they were misconfigured. So all of these things the awareness is still very low. Sometimes we still think that the targets, the attackers are only after the big guys. That's not the case. A lot of ransomware actually, we have done a research recently about understanding what are the victims of Conti. Conti is an attacker group that actually does ransomware, is associated with Russia, and what their targets are. Most of them are actually small and medium organizations that have no idea on how to do cybersecurity. So as a community, we should also address those. We should also make cybersecurity more available and awareness more available for them too.
Yeah, I see you nodding, Abhishta.
Yeah, so I think it's a next step that we have to take, right? Moving from awareness to behavioral change within organizations, within companies. And on the end of ransomware, I think what has also changed is the back end a little bit. So in the past 10 years ago, if there was something like a ransomware, how much it would cost for them to develop something like that versus today, if you want to actually do a ransomware, you can go on the darknet and actually buy a package there and deploy it. So the cost from the side of attackers has also changed, and that has changed the threat landscape around ransomware. So probably that's one of the reasons that we saw in the last 2 years or so, a lot of different ransomware attacks that have happened. And it's easier, so even if you want to attack smaller organizations, it's profitable for criminals. Right? Because they don't have to put in that much of money as before to create that solution.
And in the end, a lot of times companies are forced or will just pay.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, if they don't have a backup or if they don't have a plan in place, then a lot of times we have had many occurrences in which companies are forced to pay. So that's, but I guess Elisa can maybe talk a bit more about some of the things they might have seen, how many companies pay or...
Yeah, actually it's very interesting. In March, there was a leakage of the chats from one of these, from the Conti group, from one of these cyber attackers gang. And you could understand really their business model. And yeah, back to what you were saying, Abhishta, is exactly like that. They know how to make money, and they have an organization, they have a jar, they complain about too many working hours. It's just interesting to see how they operate. And on top of that, they also have statistics about, okay, these guys paid, or we should not attack healthcare. Oh, but maybe this is not healthcare, we can actually attack them. So there are some groups within the group about being ethical on what to attack and what not to attack. Yeah. And one of the conversations that was very interesting is about IoT. They were like, there is a lot of IoT. We should actually enhance our skill to understand how to use IoT for our entry level, which basically was a confirmation of what we were speculating as researchers, that this would be the next move. So back to what Arthur was saying at the beginning, is about monitoring the threat landscape, which is what someone like my team is doing, constantly understanding what's going on, what's are the new trends, why does it make sense for those attackers to actually do that? What should we expect from them?
Yeah, and I think that it's not just the threat landscape, it's also the installed landscape. So IoT has gotten much cheaper and much easier to install, and with the ease of installation comes a lack of awareness of the security aspects of what it actually means from a security point of view to install something into your system. And you already stated misconfigured devices. It's very easy to put it in your network. That's what makes it cheap, what makes it attractive. But that's also what makes it attractive to the hackers and the ransomware gangs, because it's probably been misconfigured, because the awareness is still low enough that it's easy to put it in place without consulting with, for instance, a security expert or your internal security team.
Yeah. Actually, this is you hit spot on. We actually did an experiment in which we bought a camera, like high-end camera, not the one used like in consumer houses, but like the one for organization and banks. So like there are a couple of brands which are used for that, and we put it, and by default it comes with the default password that you can find, of course, online, and you are not obliged to change them. And it comes with like something like 20 plus protocols enabled, like, the UPnP, which makes the camera discoverable, with like FTP, Telnet, things that are like insecure by default, that should not be enabled, because that's not the common usage anyway. And exactly what you were saying, Arthur, that makes it easier to install and also easier to hack.
Yeah. Okay, so that's a difficulty. Easiness becomes also a potential threat in that sense.
Fortunately, the cybersecurity world has gone through much of this already once in the late 90s, early 2000s, where the default passwords for default installs of operating systems were very trivial. Everything was open, and everybody knows that XP was not safe. And there's large manuals what to do if you're going to install Windows XP so that you don't get hacked. Windows 10 is different. So there's a lot we can do actually from the manufacturer point of view. And there's one of the things that we actually try to do is, yes, you have a default password, but it's used once to get in at the first install, and after that you have changed it, because we won't let you continue without having changed it.
Yeah.
And this is the kind of things that is not also an industry-wide practice yet, but that greatly helps security, and if a buyer is not aware of, makes the security aspects a lot harder to reach.
Sounds like a very simple solution.
Yes and no. It requires good process at the time of installation. So there's this simple password that you can use once, but current systems don't have a password at all.
Yeah. Okay.
So even there's multiple ways of dealing with it, and one part of the process is the server should not be completely connected to the internet when you first set it up, because that simple password is there, and if somebody is faster than you, and fortunately we're not in a situation yet where the threats are so specific that they actually target that speed of having that single point in time where the system is being provisioned. But in the times of Windows XP boxes, there were so many that were installed that there were just bands of machines scanning the entire internet if a new machine was being installed so that they could get in already at the point of provisioning.
Yeah.
I actually had a question for Arthur. So one thing you said, which was very interesting, that if the customer is not aware of some of the things, they would not know that they would have to do it. Do you think it's the responsibility of the customer to be aware of these things, or is it the responsibility of this company to make them aware?
It's a shared responsibility. Okay. So, as a vendor, we do not know what the entire landscape at a customer is. And at that point, there's probably aspects to the installed landscape of the customer that have an impact on the security. So the customer needs to be aware of their entire landscape in some fashion to adequately assess their security stance. As a vendor, we can do a lot to make sure that the stuff that we sell and the installations that we advise are as secure as they can be given the landscape that they're in. Mm-hmm. But there's a limit there. Yeah. So, for instance, we do not make network devices. But if there's a denial of service attack on the network, we're also impacted, and the security of our physical access system is impacted by that denial of service attack. But that's not something that we can control. It's just something that we can make people aware of.
Yeah. So and that probably leads to small and medium enterprises being more prone because they Exactly. don't look at maybe for them this is not the core business, right? Access yes. control might not be the core business, or IoT devices might not be the core business. They derive their value by selling whatever their main product is. Yes. And for them to see how security adds value to their main product would actually help them to maybe have some incentives to know more about their threat landscape. And yes. yeah, that's yeah. So do you actually see a lot of your customers being aware about their threat landscape?
It really depends on the size of customers. So we have quite a few customers that actually do their own threat analysis on the acceptance environments that they have for our physical access control system. And we've actually had reports back that we hadn't investigated ourselves, and we thought, wow, that's a good report. We're not vulnerable. That's also good to know. Yeah. But we hadn't looked into it that deeply, and so we have customers that actually have that very strict and very deep analysis of their security stance. We also have lots of customers that just seem to not care. And that's where the real challenge is, because if you want to improve the entire market, and if you want to disincentivize the hacking groups, you'll have to have the entire market at a better level of security. And that's where we as a vendor can actually do quite a lot.
Yeah, and I guess that's also basically your domain, how do we, in the end, convince a CEO or C-level executive to invest in this in security?
Yeah, so traditionally, I think a lot of times it was about fear, right? Like if you don't invest in security, then this would happen, that would happen. But I think it's changing over time. People are also looking at security as an added advantage. Like for instance, within Europe, since GDPR has come into play, if you follow the GDPR practices, maybe your brand has a better face in front of the public. So companies have begun to understand that providing more secure solutions, complying with certain security measures so as to protect your customers' data does provide some added value. The difficulty is that it's very hard to measure those advantages on the get-go, so that they can only be measured in the long term. So probably it has to be a long-term investment that companies make over time, and they need to plan for a continuous investment. As Arthur and Elisa both have talked about, there is also depreciation in what you invest in security. Over time, it loses value. What's secure today might not be secure tomorrow. And the problem with software systems is this can be really exponential as well. So it can go very fast.
Yeah.
0 days is one example of that. 0 day is a vulnerability that people didn't know about in the past. And if a 0 day comes out, maybe your security becomes completely irrelevant on day +1. CEOs need to account for that while making these decisions. Also, being aware of the threat landscape is extremely important. Know what your peers are doing in the field.
Yeah.
I think that one of the things that 0 days also, because naked 0 days are not all that common. But what you do often see is a newfound vulnerability with a patch.
Yeah.
So that the vendor has already prepared an update, but at the time of publication of the vulnerability, you had better update and quickly. And that time pressure is one thing that you really need to take into account. And that means that you have to have people that have enough slack in your company that can actually roll out at a moment's notice an update, or as close to a moment's notice as possible.
Yeah.
And that's a different type of investment that you make.
Yeah.
And what brings me to a whole, maybe a different trend in the industry. You see that traditionally it was all on-premise. These days there's a lot of noise about, hey, we all have to move to the cloud, and then and maybe we're safe by default. What's your view on that, Abhishta?
So I think the cloud, I think if 7 years ago I would have talked to people, they would have said, oh yeah, we are in the cloud, so we don't need to care about. So a cloud is more about liability than security, right? So if you have something in the cloud, the security is the liability of the cloud. And that's something that people, and that is also changing based on what clouds are doing today. But in 2016, that fundamentally kind of changed, because the idea was clouds are too big to fail, right? However, in 2016, there was an IoT-based botnet, again, something IoT was involved in, called Mirai, which was used to bring down a DNS service provider called a huge DNS service provider. And then we thought, okay, so now you can create a DDoS attack using a botnet made out of IoT devices, made out of cameras, to bring down a huge chunk of a cloud provider. And that was fundamentally a change that, well, clouds are probably not too big to fail. And since then, we have seen multiple cloud vendors going down from time to time, either due to misconfiguration or due to an attack. So many times it also happens because somebody puts the wrong network patches in place, and then the operations are disrupted. So. I think, and that's why companies today are moving towards a multi-cloud system. So not to depend on a single cloud. And but that's another, so now they need to have a cloud management practice and a strategy behind cloud. It's probably not enough to be secure if you're on the cloud.
Yeah, and from your point of view, Elisa?
Yeah, this is quite interesting. So actually, going to the cloud doesn't mean that you will move all your things to the cloud, right? The things are there to stay. I feel like your badge will stay there, the cameras will stay there. But actually, you introduce an additional threat, which is the communication between those things and the cloud. So if before you could claim air gap, now you cannot claim that anymore. And actually there was this case, that is like a new trend, which is surveillance as a service, right? So what the surveillance as a service vendor, they provide the cameras, they install the cameras, and then they say, you know what, actually you will not have to hire those security officers to look at the feeds and the streams from the camera, we will do it from the cloud. And so every camera is actually sending streams to the cloud, and you are hiring a bunch of security officers that are not sitting anymore in your environment, but they're sitting somewhere else looking at the cloud. And guess what? There was a default password for the misconfiguration system, and hackers managed to access basically those streams coming from all the customers of this vendor of surveillance as a service. So that's a completely different change in the threat landscape. So you need to monitor that, because you know I welcome changes, innovation. We are going to move to the cloud. Things are becoming smarter. But that doesn't come without the cost. We need to understand what the implications are and how should we behave to actually protect our systems from new things that can arise.
Yeah.
Yes, as a customer, you're also basically extending your trust quite a ways to the cloud vendor. So in that example you just gave, you trusted the surveillance as a service provider to be well secured. But that's an extension of trust that is not necessarily based on actual performance. And in the cloud world, it's harder to make that assessment correctly. And people are not generally trained to do that assessment in this case, because it seems so simple. I'll take this problem away from you. Oh yes, please do that for me.
And I pay a lot of money for that as well.
Exactly. And the trust thought is just not in the entire discussion, especially not at the sales point. And it only starts to come up often later, and in the current state of affairs, generally only after a breach has happened and the trust has completely been eroded. So that's an important aspect to take into mind.
And then I think rounding off, if we would like to give our audience one piece of advice, what would that be?
Yeah, from my point of view, I think companies need to start looking at security investment as an investment and track over long term what the benefits of those investments are, but rather than looking at it as a spending. You know, it's not just a spending. It's not money you put in and you think, well, it's lost. No, it's actually providing you added value.
It should work for the for the customer as well.
For the customers.
Yeah. And Elisa, from your point of view, one piece of advice?
I would actually add on top of that cybersecurity agenda should be on the table for every CISO. Like, okay, what is your agenda? What are you doing first? What are you doing next? What are the steps that are going to give you like a higher level of maturity for actually being ready to a cybersecurity breach? Because cybersecurity is not just if, it's just when. It's going to happen. So be prepared and start also your cybersecurity is readiness is a path. It starts with smaller things, right? Like getting visibility. What do you have in your network? How many devices? How are they misconfigured? How many vulnerabilities? What's the risk? And then what can you do against it? And then what you can do if actually you get an incident? How are you going to respond? Because a lot of times we also see even big company, they have a very, very poor response in case of a breach. They have claims they shouldn't make. They are late. They do not communicate to their customers. So there is a lot that needs to be discussed and to be prepared.
Yeah, that sounds like I have to add somebody in my company, especially for this one more person or one more investment. Arthur, from your side?
I'll just hook on to Elisa and Abhishta. Be aware. Be aware that every device that you put on online is a threat factor.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's a very short and good piece of advice. Thank you all for attending. Thank you for watching this episode of Security on Air. If you would like to know more, then please reach out to us. Our details are on the website. Thank you for watching and see you next time.